All right, welcome to a Freudian workshop. This is part of an ongoing series on a return to Freud, the discovery of the unconscious. And in this workshop, we're going to be discussing a paper from 1908 titled On the Sexual Theories of Children, where Freud specifically focuses not on, say, his theory of childhood sexuality, but rather on the way children start to theorize sexuality on their own, unconscious intelligence, in the first years of life, and attempts to develop, in some sense, a universal theory, attempts to develop a universal theory of the way children theorize their own sexuality in the context of misinformation and mythologization of sexuality by adults. So I think that that is an important context to understand where Freud's coming from. And I'll just start a presentation on this paper, and then we'll get into a discussion about it. Just a second. Share screen. I'll see that. Enter full screen. Let's see. So on the sexual theories of children from 1908. So first, Freud opens by telling us there are three main lines of evidence from which he's developing this theory, or rather investigating the theory of sexuality from the point of view of children. The first is simply observations on what children say and do. Freud, as we've come to learn throughout the first workshops on his writings, he pays an extraordinary amount of detail to everyday life. In Heideggerian sense, Freud pays a lot of attention to Dasein, or being in the world. So this is again front and center for Freud, paying attention to just what children say or do on a day-to-day basis. Second line of evidence is from adult neurotics. We know, of course, from the first decades of studying Freud's writings, or studying Freud's writings in the first decades, the material he's working with is the unconscious speech of adult neurotics. And he's specifically interested in here in marshaling the evidence of what adult neurotics remember of their childhood, and specifically childhood sexuality. The third line of evidence is inferences made by himself on the unconscious memories of neurotics. So he has his own interpretations on the unconscious memories of neurotics. So with these three lines of evidence he's assembled, this is where his ideas in this paper are coming from. Now, super interesting from a philosophical point of view is that Freud immediately starts to, say, seduce the reader with this image of an alien point of view. In other words, and I think that this is in general the foundation for scientific investigation, which is to imagine oneself from an alien point of view. In other words, to imagine oneself as if one weren't human. And if one weren't human, and one were looking just as a pure thinking being at the earth, he says the most striking fact from his alien point of view is the existence of two sexes, the idea that human beings are divided between man and woman. Now, he quickly then goes from this alien point of view to the children's point of view. And he has an interesting observation here, which is that for children, they do not question this reality at all. In other words, children don't find it strange that humanity is divided between man and woman. They accept it as a basic reality. So from the child's point of view, man and woman as basic reality are building blocks fundamental to the child's consciousness. What is alien to the child, now what's alien to Freud is that there's two sexes. What's alien to the child is an other baby. In other words, an other baby, usually their own brother or sister who's going to be born, is seen as an intruder, seen as an invasion, seen as a disturbance or a perturbance in its own existence. In other words, the baby fundamentally is a type of self-referential narcissistic form of consciousness. And it's the center of the world. So an invasion of another child is exactly what, and this is very interesting for philosophy, I think, as well. What's interesting is for philosophy is that the other child, the appearance of another, awakens and sharpens thought. In other words, here there's this interesting idea that thought starts to get set in motion almost with the presence of an other, that I'm not the only one. So he says, in the earliest of ages, the child asks the question, where did this particular intruding baby come from? I actually remember doing this when my sister was born. The second stage is that the child starts to ask, where do babies in general come from? In other words, it takes its own existence it takes its existence plus the existence of sexuated humanity, mother and father, as the base of reality. And only secondarily does it start to wonder about the origin of babies in general, due to the intrusion of another. Now, in the context of Freud's writing, and in Europe in general, there's a very common myth of the stork. It's almost comically funny and comically ridiculous, the idea that babies come from a stork delivering the baby. And it's a horrible theory because thought immediately can detect that it doesn't answer the question at all, because it just simply delays the idea of, okay, if the stork is bringing the baby, well, where did the stork get the baby? It's kind of like the theory of panspermia and life. If you have this idea that life comes from another planet, you still have the problem of deferring the origin of life, because how did life originate on that other planet? It's the same thing with the stork theory. If the stork's bringing the baby, it still doesn't answer where the baby's coming from. So Freud's interesting idea here is, or observation, I should say, is that when adults give a mythological account of the origin of babies, this leads to a distrust in adults and a sense of forbidden knowledge. And I think this is interesting to think about, specifically in regards to the mythologization of children in general, like, for example, telling them about Santa Claus and stuff like this. Does this almost insult to the child's intelligence to mythologize something like the origin of babies? Does it do a disservice to them? And does it sort of seek to shroud something fundamental in an unnecessary myth, rather than just going to the real and understanding the real itself? What Freud says is that this uncertainty of the origin of babies in the child creates a psychological conflict in the child's mind. And that this conflict in the child's mind can lead to disassociation with the original problem it was concerned with, which is basically the existence of an other, that I'm not the only one, leading to the question of, well, where did I come from? So now we go into this is interesting, is that Freud here structures the paper with the three hypotheses that children start to come up with on their own, in their own unconscious speech. The ground for their observations and hypotheses come from the mother's belly. In other words, they quickly associate that the growth of the mother's belly is related to the birth of the new baby, but they don't know how the baby gets into the mother's belly. So the first idea they have is that somehow the penis is linked to the mother's pregnancy. The child assumes, and this is a very famous Freudian observation, the child assumes, quote unquote, universal penis. What that means is that both boys and girls assume that everyone has a penis and that the boy has a full penis and the girl has a clitoris, which is a small penis. And the boy starts to hypothesize that, okay, I have a full penis, the girl has a small penis, but her penis is going to grow when she gets bigger. The child suspects that something about penile excitation and the role of the father is somehow connected to the origin of the baby, since the father also claims that it's my baby, but they can't figure out how the penis plays a role in the origin of the baby. And in this paper specifically, and in this part of the paper, I want to highlight something that's really important, I think, for everyone to think about. I know it's really impressive to me, is that Freud describes what it's like to have a penis in the most profound and interesting way I've ever heard anyone describe it, which is, quote unquote, a feeling of pressing in and opening a hole. In other words, the child connects this feeling of pressing in and opening a hole as somehow related to the origin of the baby, but it can't figure out where this pressing in takes place or where this opening a hole occurs. In other words, they don't have an idea of the vagina and they can't think the vagina. That's very interesting. Here's the second hypothesis. The second hypothesis is the child suspects the baby first comes out of the anus of the mother. Secondly, they assume that the baby must come out of the navel of the mother. In other words, they first suspect that the baby is evacuated like excrement. They then come to find this idea disgusting. And I still remember as a child, by the way, I still remember the time in my life before I thought excrement was disgusting. I remember my first reaction to excrement was that it's hilarious. Only secondarily did I find it disgusting. So the child first finds the anus theory plausible. Secondly, they find it disgusting. And they instead hypothesize that somehow the belly button or the navel must open up and the baby is taken out of the navel itself. However, the child is aware that in this theory, they're not accounting for sexual difference. And remember, for the child's reality, sexual difference of a mother and a father is fundamental. The reason they stumble upon this problem is that if the baby comes out of the anus or the navel, that must mean that men also can give birth. So it doesn't account for why only the mother's belly is growing. That's crucial. The third hypothesis is contingent on the child observing the parents having sex. On the contingency of observing the parents having sex, their hypothesis is that the sexual act is an act of violence. They don't associate sex with love. They don't associate sex with romance. They don't associate sex with They associate sex with something of dominance and violence. That's how they immediately assume the act. There is the idea that somehow sexuality and the excitation of the penis, again, back to the first hypothesis, is linked to a type of rough play, or what Freud calls romping, childhood rough play. and that it's linked to a strong person forcing a weaker person into submission, and that the stronger person, the man in most cases, is urinating into the weaker person, the woman in most cases. In other words, they can't think the idea that the penis has two substances, urine and semen. They can't think the qualitative transition that their bodies will undergo in the genital stage. And so you see, there are three hypotheses here, can't really be brought together into a complete theory of the origin of babies. So we're going to go into this here, these three theories, well, this is their theory, the three hypotheses linked together. Somehow, this is what they can think. They can think somehow the penis is related to the mother's pregnancy. But their idea is that everyone has a penis. They can think that the baby might emerge from the anus or the navel, but this doesn't account for sexual difference. And finally, they can link the sex act and penis excitation and violence, but they can't understand that the penis isn't just an organ of urination. So here's what they cannot think. They can't think that one sex has a penis, one sex has no penis. They can't think the formation of the vagina and the location of the penis and the baby in the vagina. Remember back to Freud's description of what it feels like to have a penis, of this pressing in and making a hole. They can't think that this pressing in and making a hole is where the vagina forms, basically. And third, they can't think that the sex act is motivated by ejaculation of semen. So these are the three dimensions of their theory that are missing. And that's the paper. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now, and let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. I mean, I think that there are so many interesting dimensions of this paper that I think, as it relates to my own childhood, as I tried to mention a little bit, I remember how disturbing it was for my sister to be born. When I was 6 at that age, I forget what it felt like for my brother to be born, because I was the oldest child and my brother was 16 months after me. But I've done enough observations on myself as it relates to my relationship with my brother to know that it must have disturbed me deeply. So it's very interesting to think about how the presence of another baby, especially for the first child, is almost a catastrophic event, but a catastrophic event which is crucial and fundamental for thinking. And here thinking is linked to somehow always the other, which is very psychoanalytic notion, but you see here how it goes back to the real origin of motivating and sharpening thought and solving this mystery, and also how adults shroud the baby in myth, and how in some sense this creates a artificial disunity between child and parent, that we aren't all in the mystery together. I think that's what I'm taking away from this paper. Yeah. Is that instead of the adult shrouding the infant in mystery about the origin of babies, I feel like adults should tell them everything they know in an age-appropriate way and encourage them to know that we're all in this mystery together. In other words, the origin of babies and the origin of consciousness is something we're all investigating and we're all interested in and we're all sort of participating in. And I think that this would create less neuroticism, basically, maybe, and help
Yeah,
with thinking and help with development. Yeah, Mika, please.
yeah, we definitely need like sexual education for adults, don't you think?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, it was,
what was your? I'd be interested as you
yeah,
as a philosopher, what your
yeah.
what you thought about. I mean, go with your own thought, but like the thing that I thought that would be the most interesting to talk about at the start was how Freud introduces this alien point of view and pure thinking being as, and how this is mobilized in this paper.
Yeah, it was right. I think that this was kind of like fascinating and facilitating the kind of view that he was proposing. But the way that I read the paper was that it was really interesting, but also in a certain sense quite problematic, since I don't really get what Freud is himself kind of like propounding in his own view. So I think that the basic point that he's making, or the kind of overall picture in a certain sense, is relatable, and it's really understandable in common life and so on. But he's also, in a way, I think, struggling and a bit clumsy even to come up with certain justifications of how to distinguish the kind of normal activity and the neurotic activity, especially in this context. So, well, yeah, we also get here the basic Freud saying that neurotics don't really constitute a kind of like special group of people. They are not some kind of like degenerate people that have some kind of like characteristic trait to them. He's saying that they're in his own findings that neurotic doesn't have a special mental content that is peculiar to them. They fall ill of the same complexes that's against which we healthy people, he says he's healthy and so on, but we also struggle with it. So he's saying basically that there is no like Aristotelian differentia for some kind of neurotic person. And he's also saying in the same breath that the only difference is that in healthy people, he says, healthy people know how to overcome those complexes without any cross damage, which is demonstrable in practical life. Whereas in nervous cases, the suppression of the complexes succeeds only at the price of a costly substitutive formations. And I think that this is really a clear picture of what he's trying to say. But don't you also see him kind of like struggling and trying to come up with certain justifications that he cannot really hold?
Yes,
I mean, I have another point also about.
Yes, please make.
But yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Make that point next. I want to say actually, right before I started this presentation, I took this point that you're making out of the presentation only because we saw Freud wrestling with this neurotic healthy distinction in earlier papers, and I think that in this paper here, he does make this sort of, in some sense, clearer that the ability to make a distinction between neurotics and healthy people is not a tenable distinction. And that I thought this was interesting was that the only place where this distinction is tenable is as it relates to pragmatism. And I think that's interesting because in my experience with intellectuals at university, they tend to be extremely, at least I see, they gravitate towards pragmatism. Right. And I think that this gravitation towards pragmatism is a repression of the reality of the unconscious and the existence of these unconscious complexes in everyone universally, irrespective of the fact that some people can pragmatically keep the damage down, so to speak.
Yeah. That sounds really interesting. But the way that I read this, the really point that struck out for me was that basically how much of our own intellectual, our own like research, our own theorizing, whatever we are doing, how much of it is, as Freud says, it's influenced by some sort of like a repressed sexual theory that we formed as a child about how is the origin. So he's discussing here the question of how do we, as a child, create a so-called theory about what's the meaning of life, so to say, the very origin of life, where the babies come from. He's saying that's the primordial form of the kind of inquiry or the hypothesis question here. And yeah, so he's also saying that, like, that was my point, that neurotic people aren't different from normal people. And he's saying that so much of our intellectual procedures are the way that we construct theories. It's always in somehow influenced by these infantile notions, infantile theories. And the way I read it is that, can we also discuss about the way that the so-called normal academic people also in their own careers might actually be unconsciously repeating these kind of like infantile theories that they are struggling to kind of like grasp towards. I mean, that
absolutely
notion of grasping and notion of like trying to get towards some kind of explanation of universe. And also I would like to explore this discussion by bringing in the kind of like Zizek's points about what kind of ontology does Lacanian theory actually like produce. So the kind of way that Zizek is saying is that this absolutely influences our own like ontology, the way that we find some theory as credible and other theories as incredible, and then we pick out others. So Zizek's answer is that basically why does something exist? It is because something went wrong. Yes. He's saying that something exists insofar as it is not entirely articulated what is going on in there. So symptom becomes like a universal solution.
It's the scandal of an other.
Yeah.
It's the scandal of another. Like, I think that was the crucial. I think your point's making so important. But the first question that he says the baby asks is not where do babies come from in general, which is like you could say a general ontology, you know, like a generalist ontology. But first, it's where did this particular intruding baby come from? And then that question stimulates the intellect. And so then all ontology is in some sense a defense against the existence of others, what I call the unbearable persistence of other subjectivity.
Yeah, and he also says that this is like the basic or the first model or occasion of psychical conflict in itself. Yes. He's saying that there is, but it's also in a context where the preference of one's own instinctual or one's own bodily drive gets sort of like pushed away in face of the so-called right or normal view that the adult world creates, and which is actually not acceptable or not really plausible for one, because one has another more crucial theory, so to say, going on within one's own instinctual researches. Yeah. So it's tying together. It's really dramatic, since he's really saying that the really not origin of life, but origin of some sort of philosophy is tied to this kind of like infantile notions that get suppressed or crushed when the adult world starts to come more prominent here.
Mm. I always thought that, you know, Lenka Zupancic makes a good point about how she almost criticizes the proliferation of ontologies today, that everyone's coming up with their own ontology.
Yeah, it's sort of like what Freud is here recording. I mean, I was reminded about the kind of like method of saving the appearances, which usually is credited to Aristotle and Hegel, and it's really visible that he's trying to recognize what is right about them, namely the instinctual response, and what is wrong about them. And yeah.
But I think that this desire, and what I see in the intellectuals trying to come up with their own ontology, is they're trying to explain themselves through their ontology.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And this is Hegelian to the core.
Yes, yeah. Very nice.
Yeah, he had a really nice bit about this in the paper. He's saying that the predominant or the so-called accepted normal view of adult reality is posing like an obstacle or opposition to the child's own view. And he's saying, I think this is great. for which the child's own work of research has meanwhile obtained some fresh evidence, but which is not supposed to count, and it becomes suppressed and unconscious. And the next phrase really says it all. The nuclear complex of a neurosis is in this way brought into being. So how genius is that? Like nuclear complex of the very form of neurosis.
Very beautiful. Very precise, structurally precise.
It's also really important, I think, to just connect this with how even the most educated or most prestigious like theory can be like related to this.
I really think so. I really think so. The best example I have in the contemporary scientific universe where I think something like this applies in a fundamental way is actually the example of the end of Stephen Hawking's life. So Stephen Hawking is someone who we all stereotype as a brilliant scientist, the archetype paradigm of intellect, of a great physicist, interested in the origin of things, Big Bang, black holes, and so forth. And at the end of his life, he went into this really strange mode of insisting that we leave Earth. He insisted we leave Earth. We cannot stay on Earth. We cannot be here. And we have to go to another planet immediately. This is very strange. Of course, this is right before he dies. And I think
really interesting if somebody went like really deep in questioning or querying why did the Inquisition do this? Why?
Well, it's clear to me that and in my existence, it was in university, I was interested in the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin of humans. But I realized that I didn't understand the origin of myself. And so the Stephen Hawking here, he went to the origin of time, but not the origin of himself. And so his intellect was still grappling with the mystery of his own existence.
If only he had read like Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit.
He wouldn't care. He wouldn't care.
Yeah, if only. I mean, he was saying like, "Oh, philosophy is so dead." Oh,
exactly.
And that's why at the same point, he was propounding like the most preposterous like ontologies of whatever. I mean, personally, I really find this really, really practical. This way of conceiving, and I personally, I think that some kind of message of Zizek's philosophy is that the kind of pre-modern kind of dualist, or I don't know, some kind of like cosmology, which was pre-modern times was established. It's sort of like what gets trashed or rubbished in this kind of point of view.
Yes. And I think that it's what this pre-modern cosmology is what gets revived in naive scientific ontologies because they don't really understand metaphysical foundation at all.
And we also should like ask somebody when somebody gets really like into yin and yang or something like that, we should ask like, oh, what do you find it so pleasurable to talk about the yin and the yang? And on the other hand, I think of the new materialists, like, why do you get so much like out of thinking about the new vibrating matters or something?
Yeah. Well, I think what they're doing, I think the new vibrating matter and the yin and the yang is what Freud's saying, that the child, for the child's reality and the child's intellect, they assume the mother and the father as absolute eternal substances.
Yeah. And basically himself is kind of like trying to, but I said a bit failing to assert a kind of cogito point.
Yeah. But what's missed is the original split, which allows for a subjectivity. That's what's missed. That's what's missed in the pre-modern cosmology. That's what's missed in the child's own early theorizing, is because that's what it's theorized. It doesn't know where it doesn't know itself. There's a mother and a father here. fascinating. I love thinking about the hypotheses here of what the child can think and cannot think. And also when we sort of piece together, obviously we can piece together sort of what we know and what we can think. It's a very strange geometry here. And I think that trying to figure out the movement of the penis and the formation of the vagina and the way they're related to the origin of the child, I think that the model of Klein-Bottle is here perfect. I think the Klein-Bottle is the geometrical surface which accounts for the penis and the vagina as one weird thing which produces, which has a what comes out of the whole of it is the gap of subjectivity. Very, I don't know if I went too far in my own thinking about that, but I just thought that it's very interesting to think about the geometry of the unconscious in the way it's explored here. I just think it's a treasure. It's a treasure that these papers. Really a treasure. Does anyone else have an idea that was stimulated by this paper? Anyone else have a personal reflection or an intellectual reflection that they'd like to share? Otherwise there's a few personal reflections I can share. Yes, please.
I didn't, or I don't have a younger brother or sister, so this was different for me. I am the youngest of one sister.
Interesting.
So he didn't talk about this, of course. So yeah, that was creeping in my mind. But yeah, I don't know what we can even get out of that, because I was the intruder in some sense. That's, yes, I guess, where we start. But yeah, but then
I think
what
that's
does
a really
that mean?
interesting point.
Yeah,
because I was the oldest, so I can relate to this emergence of an intruder idea. But yeah, what would be the other way of thinking about it?
Yeah, and also that he talks about
how did you view your older siblings?
Yeah, if I think about it, it's not. It's just it just is, and that's it. You don't ask questions about it, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wonder. Sorry.
My experience. Yeah, go ahead.
I wonder, because I've got an older brother and a younger brother, and I think when you're younger, like, so the arrival of the sibling after, is very confronting. And so, because I'm not the only one, I have to share, everything. But I think what happens with older children, with younger children, is often that projection of kind of rage at your arrival. You've come. So I used to be like pretty much, cuts and bruises and everything. Like often, the anger gets expressed. So I think there is a sort of a response. There is a shock, but there's also a response to that shock. And I think all through all of that, the politics of difference comes in. The difference between the boy child and the female child. The difference between, it's difference that sets up this tension. And, something about, talking about the arrival of the sibling being so confronting. But if there is no sibling, or if there's no sibling yet, through the Oedipal stage, the difference that happens anyway, the kind of the cutting across. So something around when there's a shock of, I suppose, things aren't as, the bliss is broken, mommy belongs to daddy, not just me. All of that, or I'm not the only child, there's another child. So all of those things set up, I suppose, shape our subjectivity. But I think it's about the different, the other. I suppose one way of putting it is the other, the arrival of the other, you know, whether it's a clitoris to a penis or vice versa. And something
Absolutely.
around that shaping subjectivity, shaping, like we can't have a subjectivity if we're the same. Maybe
Yes.
we'll be dead.
Yeah, and also this kind of say, I would like to just rehearse some like really like layperson view of how I understand Lacan, like his theory of how psychical organization begins is basically in the very beginning, there's like the king baby. The baby is like the emperor of the world censor. But then again, the king baby starts to realize that there is something that's like hindering the love, or something that's obstacles. So it becomes like a mystery. What's this other thing that the mother can want? Or since, well, mother is an individual person who has her own desires and own life basically, and it's good that it's the way that it is. And then when the baby starts notices that there's some kind of like conspiracy going on. There's this one other figure who I don't like, the father. He steals the mother in a way, and it's unfair now. And I need to find the thing that mother is lacking so that I can become that thing. And so when I embody the thing, then I can have back the position of king again. And the way that we can like in intellectual sense we can grow as people is to just accept that father offers us language and not some other kind of like more mysterious thing.
Yes.
Yeah, and also I would like to like make a like observation that's not perhaps out of place here. I mean, I think that I'm recognizing a pattern going on in today's like technological era where the baby is going to be the iPhone. I mean, literally, is going to try and psychically organize. The baby is going to notice the smartphone, and then the baby is going to try to be the iPhone or the smartphone. That's what I'm seeing today.
That's so interesting. I thought that was a masterful description, by the way, of Lacan's.
Yeah, it's just a layperson. I'm not like a theorist or anything, but
yeah. But yeah, I think Rashanik, you made a great point about, you know, we cannot have subjectivity if we're self-similar. There has to be this other. There has to be this difference, and at the same time, you know, then Mika goes into this, the starting point of this king baby, which falls and is constantly, instead of being grateful for language, like what we're like, me being grateful right now for just being in language with you, instead of imagining some place where I would finally be the king baby again, is, I think, the process of maturation. And then I think it's really interesting how are Freud's observations here on the genesis of subjectivity and the baby related to the historical era, the disclosure of being of the current situation as technology becomes ubiquitous, as technology becomes the parent, as screens become the other. And I remember in my early childhood, as soon as, when I was 5 years old, before kindergarten, my mother bought me Nintendo, the original Nintendo, and I was hooked.
That's cool.
You cannot pull me away from that screen. I'm playing Mario until I reach level 8, and I get the princess, and I want to get the princess, and I want to be Mario, and my brother has to be Luigi. Now, what's that say about my goddamn mind?
The way I see it, I only remember like this nasty stinging feeling about, since I'm the second brother and I have like 3 younger siblings. So
yeah, very interesting though. But now that we're in the technological era, how does this affect the conditioning of Oedipal subjectivity?
Well, when you were talking about Stephen Hawking being intent on going to another planet, it makes me think about all the other kind of technocratic sort of developments, and this idea of going to other planets, or just getting rid of workers, like we don't need humans to do things like this. Advancement, how much of this is push to advance technologically at almost kind of to our peril,
Well, yeah, I think
philosopher, the Israeli philosopher Yuval, about him?
Yeah, Yuval Noah Harari.
Yeah.
He's the embodiment of this, the technocratic ideal, and I think it's embodied in I'm a big fan of Esther Perel, and it's embodied in her question to the Silicon Valley ideology, which is that when I go to conferences and I see the future of entrepreneurship, the future of transportation, the future of communication, she says, I never see the future of relationships, the future of love, the future of sex, the future of children. It's never about human things, real things that we care about. It's always about some technocratic management of an eradication of our humanity.
I don't, by the way, like the way that you describe Harari as a philosopher, since I think that he's pretty uncritical about certain points. I mean, it might be
a historian.
I might be off topic here, but I think that Harari is too invested in the idea of like paradise, or the kind of primordial state with which we should like strive for. And he's saying that agriculture was a mistake or something like that. That's really stupid for me. I mean, he should go more into like Freudian theory to understand why he's saying that.
Absolutely. I think that the engagement with Harari is merely that he's a figure of the current ideology, perhaps.
Yeah, I would say.
Well, they need to have a philosopher supporting their aims. We've got our philosopher on board. Let's go. Let's just go. And it doesn't matter who dies in the process.
And
yeah, it's going to be negativity all the way. Sorry.
One of these things that I love the point you just made, Kadal, about like we never talk about the future of relationships and of children and all this stuff. At the same time, we see a decline in birth rates in the developed countries. So this is, of course, related. That we're designing our environment more and more towards this technocratic, whatever, cyborg fantasy, and we have like this like the smartphones as becoming the other. And just today something very unpleasant happened to me. I was looking around the internet and I found this guy, and I wanted to Google him. I don't use Google, I use DuckDuckGo. So I Googled his name and I clicked on the first link on Twitter, and it was some porn star and he was like wanking off. And I was like, what the fuck is this shit? And it was another guy, right? So simply what I'm trying to say is that you go on the internet, children will do their things and they will just see a dick, like a dick and, porn and this kind of things. So like, I think perhaps I'm skeptical of your point of let's talk about children with this and less neuroticism, because isn't it that, okay, like we can say less neuroticism, but then it will be more perversion? And how is that better?
No, what I'm saying is, here's my question. I'd like to talk about this. It's not that I know. So what I want to talk about is Freud claims that when we tell children, and this is from his era, when we tell children about the stork theory of the origin of babies, that this creates a feeling of distrust in the children because they know that's not true. And what I'm saying is do we do a disservice to children by creating some myth that's obviously not true and that gives the impression that the adults are hiding something from the children, which the adults know full well is not true. So I think that, like, I don't know what to do here. I've had this talk with one of my best friends about, should we tell children the story of Santa Claus, or should we just tell them we bought the gifts and we're gonna celebrate together as a family? Or, you know, should parents say to their children, your mother and father love each other and we did this act, you know, should they describe in an age appropriate way what really happened in such a way as that everyone is discovering together?
But like, then what if the child says, okay, can you show me? Or like, oh, you have a dick, oh, you have a vagina, can you show me? What is that? Like this kind of things. And then
I think we should show.
But hold on,
But-
'cause I think there's something we're missing here about the autonomy of the exploration. I just happened to read this paper while watching for the first time ever watching a video of myself when I was 1 year old, and in that video I was exploring something, a stereo system, and I was pushing the buttons and really enjoying that exploration. And I did that under the gaze of my mother. She was there, but it was very obvious that, like, I was completely in the center of the universe when I was playing around with that stereo. And sometimes I would turn to her, look at her, and sort of establish a connection there, and go back to exploring. So there was the above view of the mother's gaze was there. And now if we read the passage from, like, I think, I got a quote here. It seems to me that children refuse to believe the stork theory, and that from the time of this first deception and rebirth, they nourish a distrust of adults and have a suspicion of there being something forbidden which is being withheld from them by the grown-ups, and that they consequently hide their further researches under a cloak of secrecy. So it's not only that
Great point.
This last point, that they hide their researches under a cloak of secrecy, so that this view of my mother there that I was establishing contact with, that is now something that is not facilitating my exploration directly, but that is something that I need to hide my researches away from.
Brilliant.
And that facilitates indirectly then an autonomy of the individual, of individuation, really. But
absolutely, yeah, this is great.
Yeah, and also to kind of like it might become like this oppressive norm to oneself in a way.
Oppressive norm or not, it's like it is the first conspiracy theory that, okay, so there is like this cabal of grown-ups that has their secrets, and they're trying to stop my finding out of that secret. So it's seductive. Like, you really want to find out what that is, and there is an obstacle, which is the keepers of the secrets, and you have to be secret in front of them, you know. That's how you become initiated. You have your own secrets. You carry out your investigations under a cloak of secrecy. So like,
I love what you're saying. I just want to say that what I was trying to emphasize is how can we create a sense of shared exploration in the mystery that we're all
we're all keeping the secret together. That's the thing. I have to learn how to keep secrets in order for me to be initiated to this cabal of the grown-ups, right? That they're
But why can't we have the situation with you and your mother that you're describing where you can continue your further researches without having this cloak of secrecy that the adults are hiding something from you, that you can continue your research in the full knowledge that your parents are not a conspiratorial group of adults hiding the secret from you, but also joining you on your search. We're all searching because we all arrive in the same way.
But isn't that like the next step? That's when you realize that they don't even know. Like,
yes.
So and that's but
we all
first
don't
you
know.
have to assume that they know when they're keeping it away from it, you know.
Or they kind of like lack in the other, in the bigger other.
Yeah.
Yes, the parents never create this big other.
Yeah, well, the basic philosophical point that Zizek is making all the time is that there is like, we have to assume fully that the big other doesn't exist. The kind of like fully articulate sense of reality, the full articulation of all meanings. I mean, in certain sense, for some like atheist naturalist, the kind of view of natural selection would be that it contains all the meaning of all reality and all my thoughts are there.
Exactly.
Everything is there. So we have to fully accept that it's incomplete. We are part of it, and our psychical organization is also part of it, and we cannot fully like have the other in itself. But also I think that the way I hear it is that you, and also I think I accept the kind of like view that these kind of like repressed or oppressed, one could say even, sort of like theories or intimations, some kind of like, they can function like in a way as a foundation for our practical activity in our life when we are trying to grasp some like really strong mystery or some like, I'm trying to grasp the nature of reality. We might be directed by some kind of like repressed intimations. So the way I read it is that the kind of child has some kind of like, I would say some kind of like intelligence that is operating prior to articulation, and we are trying to, in a way, get into touch with that. Am I right?
I think that what you're describing to me sounds like the intellectual breakthrough I had when understanding what happened in Schelling's philosophy of these pre-logical drives as the philosophical discovery of the unconscious. So there's this intelligence that's operating prior to articulation, these pre-logical drives, and the more we can stay aligned with these pre-logical drives, the more logical our logic will be, or the more trustworthy our logic will be.
And also we might not be so misguided in our theoretical process, and this is important for me as a philosopher, since I think that we can do philosophy without this kind of, without it being the case that we are trying to solve the mystery of why mother doesn't have a penis.
I think that in my wager is that in order to be an actual groundbreaking philosopher in the 21st century, we have to be processed through psychoanalysis deeply. Then I think it's possible that we could be, but there's without being processed by the psychoanalytic knowledge, there's too much risk of a regression to a type of maybe you could say pre-Shelleyan notion of that my pre-logical drives, the unconscious, are not, as it were, repressed, and my logic is therefore totally off the mark. You know, totally trying to recreate some original scene of myself without knowing it.
Yeah. I would like to maybe make a like change the topic in a way here, because going to something like more critical. But sorry, go on.
There is something about, like I happened to also watch a video of when I was 5 years old with my 3-year-old little sister then, who was this then intruder, who immediately became the center of the world very rapidly. And I remember that too. And in this video, the camera was pointing at her and she was singing and whatever. And I kept sort of trying to be part of the picture again and again. I entered and like put myself sort of in front of the camera and then went back and then returned to it. And my interpretation of that, like I made it looked very much like I was sort of trying to provide or enact evidence in order to restore the geocentric worldview that completely disproven or yeah. So
I love these observations, especially when they're linked to deep metaphysics, like me trying to put myself in the center as equivalent to the pre-modern worldview of that we're in the center of the universe. You know, that it's totally this infantilization of the intellect. And you see that the whole movement of science as a historical phenomenon is the decentering of the infantilized intellect.
Yeah, the repetition of the trauma.
Yeah. Mika, did you want to stay?
Yeah, I have something I would like to point out of contradiction here, or maybe embody the contradiction here and bring out a difficult topic here. And don't you also think that Freud, in a way, also fails in this part? I mean, he basically, in the beginning, he says that this is the way that he writes these things. It's predominated by the male perspective. It's what he says there. But in a way, I think that he starts to crumble and he loses this when he starts to think about how the theory that in attributing to everyone, including females, the possession of the penis, such as the boy knows from Sopani. I think that I'm going to call bullshit on Freud here. I mean, there's something that we absolutely cannot say about Freud in this context. And well, basically the idea is that the boy finds that the penis is like the leading zone, the erotogenic zone, the chief autoerotic object. And its value is estimated and logically is reflected also in the inability to imagine a person who is without this essential part of his own body. And so this is basically the kind of why we have the castration complex looming all the time, and why the threat of castration itself is so terrible. But basically, when he's saying that in seeing females, there is some kind of like idea of a small penis in there that's going to grow eventually like into a real and genuine penis or something. I think that he's going astray in perhaps just following uncritically some kind of like maybe contemporary predominant opinion of science in his era, which is not really, I don't think this is essential for his point. We can separate this out and keep the good parts. So regarding like the clitoris as a diminished or smaller or homologous penis is perhaps wrong here. And I think that the idea that he says that the girl is going to feel themselves as unfairly treated since they lack something that is essential to the male body. I mean, this is anti-feminist to the core, I think. And when Freud says that when a girl declares that she would rather be a boy, Freud says that we enlightened know what the deficiency is to her wish that she intends to put right. And this is unacceptable to any point. I mean, I don't think that we can preserve this task. I mean, I'm saying that Freud is basically accepting the kind of chauvinist male order of the world as the pinnacle of mental health in a way, don't you think? And he fails to accommodate, failing to accommodate to the chauvinist male world is going to be like the condition of mental pathology for him. But whereas the originator of psychoanalysis, meaning Joseph Breuer, already saw the kind of chauvinist mail order as pathogenic in itself. But this is really like the topic of penis envy is that it is sort of like postulated into the mind of the girl, and then it becomes like a theoretical obstacle for thinking. And we, in certain sense, the kind of predominant psychoanalytic theorists, they have these mysteries or these kind of like mystifications about these things, and then they just accept the ideas without further questioning them even further. And,
well, Freud makes a mistake of reinforcing the penis rather than the way the boy is treated in culture or in family. So in a way, the girl may want to be the boy, not because he has a penis, but because he gets favors, or he gets to play with balls, or he gets to go run around. And the girl in the 1900 would be told, wear a nice little white dress and sit in the corner. You can't go and throw a ball. So, you know what I mean? Like, it's his obliviousness to, I think he's kind of too much in the biology and not in the kind of the, sociology of it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is
sorry, there's a point that I would like to like preserve also, and that it's a point that the kind of like brooding and doubting that we experience in adult life, it's related deeply to this point, and the point of seeking the kind of maternal penis and then finding out that it's missing, and then the existence of the cavity and all this, and the failure of discovery is basically something that Freud says is going to be the prototype of all later intellectual work. I would say that for some people, which is directed to the solution of problems, and the first failure has a crippling effect on child's whole future. And maybe we can separate this point from the earlier point that I was making, but I mean, Karel, you had...
Yeah, I think that, so this is really important that you brought this up, Mika, and Rashanik. I think that your analysis is spot on as well. I just want to give reference to the last pages of Zizek's Less Than Nothing as it relates to part 2, which is the limits of Hegel, where he talks about how Freud leaves us at the level of symbolic castration in the name of the father, but cannot think primordial negation and object petit a. So in other words, in moving from Freud to Lacan, what we gain is rather the absence, which becomes object petit a, and an escape from the barring of, like, basically being left as a barred subject in a type of first order atheism. And I think that this relates to the dimension of subjectivity as feminine, which Zizek always maintains, and the location of object petit a and lack as the truth of the subject. So in some sense, by staying in this penile fantasy, Freud is understandably frustrated, and his social theory is lacking really a deep understanding of, I think, what Lacan brings out in his writings. I don't know how that relates to your ideas, Mika and Rashanik, but I really think it's correct here, what you're saying. I think Freud struggles with absence, and in that sense, Freud's mistake is he's, at this point in his career anyway, still in a type of logical positivism.
And maybe it's the problem here that's trying to preserve some sense of normalcy as a standard for mental health is.
Yes.
He's struggling with that, and he's also, on the other hand, he's saying that there is no like normal cycle. We are all neurotic, blah blah.
He's struggling because he's developing new knowledge. That's what's great about Freud, is that he's developing new knowledge genuinely. He said in a previous paper we covered that my ontology doesn't just spring out of nothing as a complete system. He says, all of the knowledge I'm generating is happening in a very contingent way as I'm discovering my language is evolving. And at this stage in his career, he's absolutely trapped in male chauvinist universe. Definitely trapped here. And in that sense, it makes sense that, you know, the feminist critique of Freud is in some sense, you know, Freud ends his career by saying, you know, what does woman want? You know, he doesn't understand the feminine perspective in some sense. And I think Lacan brings this out. Lacan brings this out, especially Lacan brings this out in his final seminars.
Yeah, but also like mirror states.
And
saying that there also that subjectivity is feminine in a way. It's really interesting.
I have something.
Doesn't.
Yes, Ishak, yeah.
Let me focus on a sentence. I'll share on the chat and read it.
Sure.
Let us assume, however, that the child's thinking soon becomes independent of this instigation and henceforward goes on operating as a self-sustained instinct for research. So originally, the child's curiosity is instigated by the vital exigency about the intruding new baby. But Freud assumes that it becomes independent and becomes purified, like a scientific curiosity. But I'm a bit suspicious about this assumption. I think it doesn't really become independent, and it's not really forgotten. Like the unconscious, the vital exigence about intruding rivals continues to function, continues to instigate curiosity. And there is no pure curiosity. Behind curiosity, there's an incuriosity that is the for ignorance and repression.
Yeah.
I wrote about it and let's share that too.
It's sort of like Freud just leaves it out and just cuts the thinking short in there.
So it is related to Freud's identification with science. He's a scientist and he's to assume this pure curiosity, assume the existence of pure curiosity, but it's impossible.
Right.
I think.
Right. I think that. Yes, Everin, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, doesn't Alenka Zupancic make a feminist reading of Freud? I'm quoting her. Man believes that he's a man, but woman pretends that she's a woman. I mean, like, doesn't this make woman more subject because she is aware of the lack, incompleteness? So if you don't take phallus as a penis, not something physical, and take it like this, doesn't she bring a feminist reading of what we talk rather than taking Freudian theory as something male chauvinist and sexist?
Many have, Everin, and Alenka does it well.
Yeah.
Many have. There are many feminist Freudians and Lacanians.
Johanna Kopencic as well, I think. Johanna Kopencic, yeah.
It's not in principle impossible or even difficult to make I mean, Freud is read in feminist literature often, and Freud is a foundation, I would say, and a part of I mean, psychoanalysis and Freud is, to me, a friend of feminism. We're just saying that in this particular paper and in certain instances, Freud, I mean, Freud is, we have to remember what we're studying here is the emergence of new knowledge. And that is coupled with constant mistakes.
Yeah. And also
when Freud, the great thing is when Freud makes mistakes, he usually makes mistakes in an interesting and intelligent way that we, like, for example, my favorite example is the way Freud articulates death drive. He doesn't do it that, he makes mistakes there, but he nonetheless points in an essential dimension. So that's very common in his readings, which is why it's important, I think, to go through it like this.
Yeah, I would like to make a comparison that's explanatory here and maybe explain. But if you have like a shirt which is really filthy, like you have a shirt that's completely stained in ceto dust and everything, then you have trouble finding one stain in it. But if you have clearly just white shirt on and it has one shit stain in there, it's going to sting out, like, yeah. But also, and I think that we should be really critical about these notions because they are in a way inscribed to the received opinion of the international psychoanalytic organizations, since they have to believe in a way into bullshit in certain ways. And it's really, for me, it's great that Lacan was actually excommunicated from there.
We have to also remember that in the tradition that I think, at least I know me and I know Mika Ishik well enough to say that, you know, intellectually, I know well enough to know that the tradition that we are curious about is this relationship between Freud, its extensions in Lacan, and we have to remember that in the extensions in Lacan was an enemy of the psychoanalytic organization. So it's very complex here how the theory developed. And we have to have a meta understanding. And this is, I think, where Hegel comes in, historicity of knowledge, is that, I mean, Freud's developing a certain form of knowledge, and then that form of knowledge has a actuality in history which can become ideological, which can become misused, which can become distorted in many ways. And that's a part of the knowledge somehow as well, the becoming of the knowledge.
It's in a way a form of knowledge that cannot be not misused in a way, since it's so difficult.
I liked Lacan's notion that almost psychoanalysis is too, I think he said something like fragile or vulnerable for the world to exist. Like that, like psychoanalysis is impossible in some sense to exist in the world.
Also, I have a comment on my personal ruminations. I have come up to an understanding of why what's going on and so on. But in I think psychology is kind of like the field of struggle today, mostly because I mean, I'm dissatisfied with this explanation since it's so primordial, but it seems that we have some kind of innate desire to start asserting our own authority as soon as we begin to talk about how psyche is organized. I mean, how are these two connected? Why is the field of psychology so into authority? Why is it so? Why do we have every psychology department dominated by male assholes, basically? Some, not universally the case, but it might be the case that as soon as we begin to theorize about our own psyche, the kind of male chauvinist points becomes really the kind of the king's points. And here we can, I think, in a fruitful way, connect the way that Zizek would connect Lacanian theory of phallus with Hegel's theory of monarchy in a way. The phallic signifier, which perhaps is the crown the king puts on, it's really the kind of point of castration. It's really empty. The king cannot do anything but just sign his name into a paper and then produce beget the next one. I don't know, that's going into deep waters and so on.
No, but these are the type of waters we want to swim in, I think.
Mm.
Does anyone have any? I mean, I think that to me, I want to say that the most infuriating aspect of my existence in academia is dealing with this problem of the phallic signifier and the unconscious monarchy of the academic structure, which goes so deep that you can have theorists of distributed and collective intelligence who are still acting and performing as the monarch.
Mm.
That's how deep the unconscious structure goes. And at the same time, how do we function? How do we do differently? I think that maybe the internet is emancipatory in certain dimensions. But you can have these Deleuzian fantasies of multiplicity in a virtual field and stuff like this. But still, when it comes to embodiment and authorization, I know something that Ishik talks about a lot. There's tremendous problems. You know, I think in my doctorate, I say something like, you know, we all have to somehow become the phallic signifier somehow. We all have to become the our own king in some sense, but maybe that doesn't work either. Maybe that doesn't make sense.
Well,
I don't know.
Maybe we do both. Maybe we become the phallus and we are castrated. We're constantly.
I think that's my personal. This is how I personally act. I try to be a king who knows lack.
But also, we do get castrated. We get sick. We get COVID-19.
Exactly, and to accept that I am just a lack. I am just a miserable idiot in his room by himself. I can't do anything, and yet I'm here still trying to go deep as I can.
Well, and the castration could be somebody said something and you feel really hurt. Oh,
I know,
like,
yeah.
Or
I feel really hurt.
God, they're making all this money and I'm not making that much money.
Exactly.
You know, we're always been castrated, but we're also kings. We're both.
Yes, we're both.
Authentic phallus.
Yes.
Sorry?
That's what Barth calls authentic phallus versus the fake phallus, I believe.
God, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
As Cadell said, in order to get into comedy, we should first confront the tragedy. I think in order to confront the tragedy, we have to accept castration. And as Lacan says, put a distance to our symbolic identities,
yes,
which are all phallus or something like these things. And we observe it, especially in academia and other professions as well, that people think they possess something if they have a symbolic title. And their lives are pretty miserable as far as I can observe.
Is there then a way that we can avoid becoming cynics?
But can we stay there at, so what does accepting the castration mean, really?
It's accepting that accepting that everyone is in some sense lacking, and your view that someone has the phallus or someone is the king is a kind of perspectival illusion or distortion. So like, for example, if I'm a PhD student and I think that my PhD supervisor or some professor who has tenure has the phallus, this is a perspectival distortion that's being cast by my own psyche, that I'm not realizing that everyone is lacking and that my image that someone isn't lacking is something that's an unconscious projection of my own psyche.
Yeah, but doesn't that bring out the propensity to become a cynical person in a way?
I think it's tragedy to comedy. We have to eventually, we have a chance to be comedic, ironic, not just fully irony, but like a meaningful irony, but and a meaningful comedy. Because for example, sorry, Sebastian, go ahead.
No, I want to take that one more step, because you can accept the fact of the castration, or you can accept, and you can accept the fact of the illusion of their not being a castration
right.
as well. And that is a component of a motor, right? As well, that like, okay, so there is this illusion.
Yeah.
I do project these ideals. I say
Yep.
that. Nevertheless, I keep projecting these ideals. So sure, I can accept on one level that, well, I'm castrated. The world is castrated. There's a fundamental lack in the world. But doubting that, like inserting doubts into that acceptance, is something that I think is extremely deep. It's like,
Yes.
if you look at Thomas the doubter, the apostle. So when Jesus died and there were news of his resurrection, and the apostles came back to well, some apostle came back to the others with the news that Jesus has been resurrected. Thomas is the one that does not believe in this. He says that he will only believe in this if he sees the wound of Jesus with his own eyes and touches the wound with his own hand. So from the doubt of not only of the, well, he's seen that Jesus has been crucified and died, but he doubts the fact that he can actually be restored from that. And what happens subsequently is that, like, Jesus comes back, and Thomas the doubter is, from his doubt, because of his doubt, rewarded with a supreme enlightenment of actually putting his hand in the wound of Jesus Christ.
That's a beautiful point.
And so it comes from the doubt, like it's not yeah.
I think that in some sense, accepting lack and going into it deeply gives you the possibility to see the positivity of lack. And in fact, that lack and castration are necessary for there to be a subject that gets to have a space in the world. Because if there really was a king, there would be no space for a subject. So we can, I think, turn around. I was listening to a talk by Osho this week where he says we should turn the word emptiness and lack into spaciousness. That because there's emptiness and lack, there's spaciousness where there's potential.
Yeah, that's why the like in every single mandala you see at the center of it, there's emptiness. It's emptiness at the center of creation.
Yeah.
That's
it's fascinating. Bart talks about this in the global empire. Mika, also to your question of how do we not be stuck in cynicism, he talks about 3 types of nihilism. So the first one is naive nihilism. This is all the people creating the ontologies with their personalized neurosis.
Right.
And then you have cynical nihilism, and that's the postmodern relativism of like, oh, there's no truth, we can never know. So first one would be like a naive masculine, second one like a hysterical feminine, and then the third one is affirmative nihilism. And this is kind of where it's the most fascinating speculative third. Yes. I think
Zizek references this with Ray Brazier's Nihilism Unbound, that we should fully accept nihilism as in an affirmative gesture. This is great.
And it's so fascinating that, like an authentic phallus, he can show his castration to everyone, and it will make him more phallic even.
Yes.
Yeah, like Donald Trump.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in a way that in we can like be fully enlightened. We can be like fully into the notion that the way that I experience authorities and illusion, or it's sort of like form of overture. I can propound these theories and then experience some kind of like distance to it, and the result can be some kind of like universalized, I would say, cynical response, or some kind of like detachment from symbolic reality that exists actually out there. So this is, I think, that some theories, some thinkers cannot overcome. They cannot really question their own presuppositions of how they steer first towards some authority, and then they declare this authority, or this authority itself declares a position of lack, and they both become cynical in a way which only supports their own mental economy and their own like wishes of the other. And the way I see it is that we should have this kind of like, even if it is an illusion, we should have some authority figures who are not basically stupid, unintelligent.
Yes.
The way that they operate, it's markedly different. And I think that Zizek is right in saying that the authentic master doesn't really say what you desire. In opposition, I think that the many of the Asian like despotic master figures, like they just seem to possess the kind of like innate substance of joy or whatever. They portray this, and they play fully on the idea that it's an illusion, or appearances are the surface and there is the holier or the more real beneath it, and so on. They play with this, and the result is just universalized cynicism or resignation, which serves just one's own or psychical economy. And I'm interested in a way that a real master would be somebody who does something really clever, and they have a genuine practice of some sort. They have their life in order, and they are saying that, yes, you can do it. You just do something intelligent, that you can do it. It's possible.
Absolutely. I to me, the guiding idea that I use, and it's very similar to what the distinction you're making with Zizek here, is that a bad master is trying to keep your identity underneath him. And a good master is someone who gives you back to yourself, that basically you can do, that I'm not trying to tell you my desire and getting you to identify with my desire. That it's really, you can do it and the field is open.
But is that masculine or feminine?
I think it's androgynous in some weird way. Because it's you know, the thing that always I don't know, frustrates my neuroses is when I'm under a master who's positing an object of desire which my speech must be aligned to. And if my speech isn't aligned with it, then my funding is taken away, or I'm an outcast, or I'm out of the group or something. But that the object of desire, or the truth, is already known and already posited by the master.
Doesn't that mean that it's not really sexualized?
Well, the good master's desire is voyeuristic, right?
Can you go into that?
That the object of desire is undefined. It's like indirect. It's you as the good master, you want to facilitate the movement of the students towards the object of the student's desire.
Yes.
Right. And you don't that's alien to you, right?
Yes.
So yeah. Like your own object of desire is alien, but then there is the double alienation of like yeah.
And you have to have a good enough understanding that even your object of desire is alien to you.
Yes.
And that's what the bad master doesn't know.
Yeah, exactly.
The bad master doesn't know himself well enough to know that his own object of desire is alien to him.
Yeah.
He's constantly positing that he knows the object of desire, even when, if you study his identity across time, it's not.
Yeah. And the student,
and if you bring this up to this bad master, of course he'll negate you.
Yeah.
And he has the power to do so.
And simultaneously, the student is trying to figure out what the object of desire is, of the master's object of desire.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So.
And the bad master exploits this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The bad master exploits this because he tries to use this unconscious of the student to get the student to identify with the master permanently. And that's back to Hegel's master-slave dialectic, is that the master's identity is dependent on the slave's identity. And if the slave's identity is removed, then the master loses his identity because it's just based on the slave. That the slave identifies with me.
It seems that there are some certain type of characters who like to display themselves as possessing the full symbolic within themselves, and basically just trying to pose for being able to explain everything. And this is dependent, this picture, on their being some kind of like slave who becomes their kind of like libidinal support for their picture. And yeah,
right.
And it's the joke is on them though, since they
Yes.
claim to be possessing fully the symbolic, but instead they are fully possessed by the symbolic.
Yeah. The joke is on them in the end. Yeah.
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 What about a student and a teacher who connect really well and who feed off each other and who kind of bounce off each other and trigger new thoughts? How does that look in the, I suppose, the dialectic? What's going on there?
I think Zizek emphasizes that the student-teacher relationship is absolutely necessary process. So you need,
and it's also really Hegelian to the core. I mean, Hegel, what he's doing, he's basically like an educator in a way. I mean, even in phenomenal spirit, he's trying to make like a universal education for the European mind.
So it's not a master slave. It's something like, it doesn't fall into that, or is it a?
We don't like the terms master and slave because they're connotated in a certain way. Hegel used the words lord and bondsman.
Yeah.
We can use the word student and teacher. It's arbitrary, the words we're using, because it's the form that we're interested in.
Yeah, I think that when Hegel writes about the relationship, he's trying to capture some sort of like I would say perhaps even metaphysical structure, which in a way organizes our social reality in a way, and the characters of Herr and Knecht, they are in a way like metaphorical representatives of this structure, which takes place independent of them, and you could place whatever into the structure. And the structure is basically that the master is conceived as the essence, or he is the essence. His desire is to consume the product, and the way that the master can enjoy is only by having in the product inscribed the negativity of the slave. The slave works on products since he submits to the power of the master, and when the slave is working on products, he's basically seeing himself as the inessential part of the relation. But the joke's on the master, since when the master is keeping what Hegel calls self-relation or being for self as the essence, the master is basically the one who gets really poor. I mean, the master doesn't get to work. The master doesn't get to face any kind of like challenge, which creates the demand to develop oneself. But the master, I mean, the slave gets to work and gets to see his own negativity in the product that he's like working on. And the way that I read Hegel is that Hegel himself recognizes the kind of historicity of this all, and he's saying that he needs to, as a figure, also inscribe his own historical situation into the work, which transforms metaphysics of Western thinking itself. Sorry to be so long about it. Yeah, I was just reading it the other day.
I think, Mika, this point's so important. I want to say there's a few points I could say here, but there's one that's really sticking out. I hope it's relevant. Is there's a book I really like by Benny Shannon called The Antipodes of Mind, which is about a 10-year phenomenological investigation of ayahuasca. And the interesting thing is he starts out the book with one of his own first visions on ayahuasca, where he was given the vision that historical spirit is closer to God in the slave position than the master position. Yeah. And I think that is basically a Hegelian observation, that the joke is on the master, that the slave and the work of the slave is closer to the truth of spirit and figuring out the truth of the self. And in my own experience, it's that work underneath the master, but is the slave's own most, which is the true potential. Because of the master's position, their identity is so rigid that they don't, in some sense, they block their own potential. Yeah. Because there's too much, they're not willing to go into the negativity. And the slave is forced in the negativity constantly having to reinvent his identity.
So wouldn't it be like, what if we apply this to the child's sexuality? Like the parents as the master, the child as, this research as his own product, being underneath the parent. This would be lovely to explore.
Dimitri, that's a brilliant point. That's so good. That brings us full circle.
Yeah, but in the end, I would say that the prospects of the slave, they are not that great either.
We all die.
Yeah. I would say that it's really not the case that the master is not willing to face the Hegelian notion of negativity. I mean, the master is too much on the negativity, I would say. Master is fully able to consume fully the being of essence and go right to the end. And that's self-destruction, basically. Whereas the slave is going to keep the desire in check and start working. And the way that I experience work in itself, it's keeping the negativity at place in a way.
But isn't it, at least in what I recall from phenomenology of spirit, that it is the slave that strives for emancipation who has to confront the deepest negativity, which is death itself? Like, for example, like the old story about slaves in the South, yeah, who would cut their master's hair with scissors and instruments where they could slit the master's throat, but they won't do it. They want to stay slaves because they're not willing to confront death itself. And of course, we know slaves in the South had to confront death itself to get free, because the masters would send dogs on them. They would send, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So would you then
say going to be that the kind of way that we phenomenologically experience, there is some kind of intimations of this abstract negativity in all our self-relations, and the way that they go into the different life struggle or the battle for life is going to be that the master is the one who is willing to go to the end in there, and the slave sort of like covers the way and doesn't really mean to go fully into the negativity of the. But we all have some kind of like intimation of negativity or within us, in our experience. That's the Hegelian wager, that we in a way know death already.
Yes.
So then the kind of current movements, commonly referred to as woke, are a flipping of the master slave.
Can you say that again, Rashmanik?
So, the current movements like BLM and it's a flipping rather than an engaging with the slave process.
They're the masters now, and they're trying to make the people who were the masters the slave.
Yeah.
And that's actually being performed Like I was speaking to Raven, who I've done some conversations with on my channel about what she's observed in BLM protests in Portland, and they would literally have white men shackled up as the slaves in the South were, and Black people walking them through the streets as a performance of the past in a reversed way.
That's hilarious. Isn't that like a hysterical joke in a way?
Well, they're taking it seriously.
Yeah.
But
it's trying to seem like they're serious about it, but it's a joke. I mean, it's an authentic revolution. You know, it's revolution in the astronomical sense.
But it's not even a revolution because it's being incorporated into every layer of American organization.
What's revolution? It's moon turns around, you see the other side, and then it's revolution.
I have a question. Like if death is the ultimate Hegelian master, what's the joke on that?
Sex.
Huh?
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think what Zizek would say is the ultimate joke is that we're immortal.
Yeah.
Sex is obviously
elaborate.
Yeah, can you go into that, Sebastian?
Well, it's
if death is the ultimate,
it's like it contrasts with the eternality of death, right? That death, it's the end, and it stays. Things that are dead stay dead. Sex incorporates death fuses death with creation, right? So it's this is too much for my words.
But it's a nice thought you're pointing in that direction. That's nice, and it could help us with the understanding immortality. But let's not be too ambitious. We're not going to solve the problem of immortality today. We're going to have to wait for future workshops where immortality will be fully revealed to us and all our
all your sexual theories of infantile life, they will become revealed to you eventually. I mean, this is the wager we always get.
I think this is probably a good place to wrap up. Although if anyone would like to say anything about this paper and this conversation before we wrap up, please do.
Well, just repeating the point that the idea of like there being a smaller penis in women, and it's, how ridiculous is that? But in a way, Freud seems to like waiting for the authentic real woman to emerge out of the troubles of puberty and so on, but woman doesn't exist. This really crucial thesis.
Yeah, I got something to add that takes us back a little bit to the beginning, which is I spoke to a very close person, a girl, about this early explorations of sexuality, and here in Sweden, well, I think there is less taboo about that. So parents are more willing to give you a proper sexual theory, to supply that for you, and they did in her case. But she still had this rebuffal of her investigations and investigative motivations when she asked her parents about death, and they gave some sort of ridiculous stork theory to her.
Interesting.
So from that, and that kickstarted her sort of secret investigations and research, the complete dissatisfaction with the stork theory of death.
I think going on that, I think we should make the point that's worth making, that the origin of Buddhism and the story of Buddha is in a similar process where the Buddha, or I forget how to say his name, Siddhartha, is sheltered from any notion of death, any notion of old age, any notion of things decaying, and that the realization of that things are going to decay and die motivated him to become what he became.
Yeah, it's a nice symmetry. The investigation, the realization that things can be created, that a child, an other can be created. And then the realization that things, that the other and myself and the subject can die and decay. Both of those things are potent enough to spark this sort of spiritual quest for enlightenment. And I mean, this woman, she was having lesbian orgies when she was 6. So, you know, it's like.
Yeah, something that I would like to say in connection is also that in a way, Freud makes something in this text is really revolutionary, but also he's in a way giving a conservative view, and I would say that it's not entirely like correct in a way, but it contains some seeds of truth that I myself find very practical. And he in the end discusses marriage actually in a way that I find really interesting and really enlightening in a way, and that's something that we didn't get to discuss. Yeah, and he's saying in the end about how in marriages there is kind of like primordial sex battle. I mean, I'm reminded of the Greek gods of Hera and Zeus, and they're obviously sort of like representatives of this kind of like conflict that the child, I mean, Freud begins off with the idea that how weird is it that there are two sexes in one like complex going on. And this is in Child's view, Child sees that in many marriages the wife does in fact recoil from the husband's embraces since it seems violent. And I mean, how common is like violence in close marriage relationships? It's really a big trouble. I mean, even societal like problem. And these kind of like conflicts within marriage relations may give the impression that the mother is only there to defend herself against some kind of like acts of violence. I mean, this is Freud's words. And it becomes like, almost like a feminist here. And at also times the marriage can offer the child spectacle of an unceasing quarrel, Freud says, expressed in loud words and unfriendly gestures, so that he need not be surprised if the quarrel is carried on in the night as well, and finally settled by the same method by which he himself is accustomed to use in his relations with his brothers and sisters or playmates. I mean, Freud is saying that we project the kind of like childish quarrel and violence, which is it's normal for a child to like have a rough and tumble play. I mean, Jordan Peterson is really spot on about emphasizing the way that we need to give children space to like just fight off things so that they develop their motor cortex or whatever, the parts of the brain. So if the house is dominated by unfriendly gestures, by being like constantly irritating, it's really easy today. We as married couples, it's really easy to go into like constant negative like feedbacks and everything like that, and it's really a societal damage that causes a lot of unnecessary suffering in the world. And I mean, Freud can be like really useful in this area.
I think what's important to emphasize here, I mean, this is something I think that maybe most of you know, but maybe good for other viewers, is in my experience, the people, the academics who dismiss Freud are oftentimes correct in some of their criticisms, but then they don't take on the burden of going into the depth of these problems which are raised by psychoanalysis. They, in some sense, we don't need to think about Freud. He was wrong. Therefore, we can have a objective view where we don't have to think about social history in the type of weird, intimate way that Freud was, with penises and vaginas and mothers and fathers. And that's the mistake, I think, is seeing that Freud made lots of mistakes, and then also taking on the burden of thinking this topic, which is extremely complex and difficult to think, and historically incomplete and unknown, and we're a part of it.
Yeah. And also the societal damages of ignorance in this regard, they are really unforgivable in a way.
It is. It is. It is. That's a good place to end, I think.
Yeah,
I think
it was good, nice meeting. We are back.
The social damage of the ignorance of these topics is enormous. So let's keep going. I'll send out an email as always for in the next 2 weeks. We'll do it again. So I look forward to that, and I hope to see most of you again in 2 weeks. This was a really, I think, productive conversation, and happy to be back.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks for organizing them.
Thank you all.
All right. Yeah. Bye.
Have a great day, guys.